Welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. George, how's it going?
Doing good, Richard. Excited for today's episode.
It was a amazing feat of Skype that allowed this episode to happen. We had a 4-way interview between Robert Montgomery, Jayme Amos, and Paul Goodman, which was phenomenal. Like I've wanted to interview Jayme Amos forever. I've wanted another lawyer. And on top of that, we got Paul Goodman, who is a dentist and a broker and has an awesome Facebook group. And we introduced all each other, and this was hosted on Jayme's podcast as well. So we'll get into that in the episode. But this episode, if you notice the title, is actually a throwback to season 1, because we're diving into associateships again, because this topic comes up quite a bit online, but with a slant of how will this affect my future ability to practice and do what I want to do. So it's a throwback, but I think it's a worthy throwback, and we'll talk about some of the implications of this after the episode.
Absolutely. I with our season format, it just doesn't belong in season 2, but so many of our listeners who have contacted me are dental students, and I think it's more relevant for them right away if they're planning on going into an associate with projections of ownership one day.
No, absolutely. And that's why I was more than happy that we got this, is because that's who a lot of our audience is. So, okay, here we go with the interview. I've got with us today an awesome group of, this is kind of like a mini brain trust. I can't steal Alan Mead's format, but this is as close as we can get on the Shared Practices podcast. And I'll start with Jayme Amos, who has his own podcast, Ideal Practices, Dentistry's Ideal Practices podcast. He's got basically a startup consulting firm, coaching, everything all in one. If you're trying to do a startup and you can't wait for season 3 of our podcast, Jayme Amos is someone who can take you there, hold your hand, get everyone in line, make sure that everything happens. He's your go-to guy. And unfortunately, Jayme, you and I missed each other at the January's Voices of Dentistry conference. I was there on Saturday and you were there on Friday, and we were like ships passing in the night. We didn't really get to meet and talk too much.
Well, if we're both ships, thanks for the introduction, Richard. If we're both ships, you would definitely be like the cool modern ship, and I'd be like the old clunker that's kind of like banging around a little bit. That's just trying to stay afloat.
Mine would be the one that you buy, and then you realize like there really wasn't too much to it. It looked nice, but then you're like, this is going to need a lot of repair. So we're both maybe in need of some work. So
I love it. Well, yeah, my team and I love startups. I couldn't be doing what we do and changing the lives we do for doctors stepping into private practice ownership if it weren't for my team. Incredible group of experts who we help startups open successfully all over the country so the doctors can be deeply fulfilled in practice ownership. And I won't belabor this, but I just get so excited. One of our recent clients just outside of near Denver, Colorado, she opened up, and on her 4th day in practice ownership, she had 209 patients, which
Holy
is awesome.
Cow.
But then on top of that, I mean, more fulfilling than just the number of patients. Sure. We help people become successful. Over $1 million in the first year. Sure. We've helped a lot of people do that. But beyond that, she loves what she does. She was able to quit her associateship the very next Monday. She was able to walk in and say, secret is I've kind of hated this place for a long time. I'm out.
Nice.
So we love startups, and candidly, we couldn't do what we do without brilliant minds who have preceded us, like 2 of our other guests, if I may. Do you mind if I introduce our other guests here?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. So the 2 other folks who we have on are guys who I have become good friends with, who I have dear respect for, and who have impressed me over and over again. The cool byproduct is they're also from my favorite city in the United States, my hometown metropolitan area of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So on deck, we have Rob Montgomery, attorney, owner of law firm in downtown Philadelphia, the Montgomery Law Group. They have 20 plus years experience, guys, in dentistry and real estate, which is a lethal combination. I mean, if you don't get it right, you're dead. If you do get it right, you win. So dentistry and real estate combined, Rob's firm, that I think I'm allowed to say, I hope I don't hurt people's feelings, they're the best in the country, if not the best in the world. With what they do, they've been a pillar of helping dentists get good guidance and creating great successes. And Rob is also a great guy with a huge heart who does good, not just practices law. 20 plus years. I mean, I can't say enough. Multi-practices, startup practices, you name it, Rob's been amazing. So drum roll, please, Rob Montgomery.
Welcome.
Rob, would you mind saying hello?
Thank you, Jayme. That's a great introduction. And I am not offended by any of that. Thanks. Awesome. It's always a pleasure. We do a lot of work with mutual clients, and there's a lot of respect. And I think we all work well together and know what each other can do well and what we rely on each other to do. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a job, obviously, for all of us, but it's a job that I enjoy going to every day. So thanks for that nice introduction, Jayme.
Yeah, my pleasure. Meant every word of it. And I know we're both, all three of us are also fans of the wonderful and renowned Dr. Paul Goodman. I've got to say, Paul, I am very happy that we were able to meet in person. Thank you for having me speak on one of your stages in downtown Philly recently, because guys, Paul has one heck of a reputation as a guy who just throws himself out there for the good of dentistry. It's apparent and obvious. You look in almost any Facebook group, somehow somehow Paul is contributing simultaneously to like 40 groups at the same time, all with different concepts, all really high value knowledge, all totally free. I mean, this guy just gives, and then he chooses to give again, all for the good of dentistry. He's also a faculty member at an incredible residency program. He's been a noted expert and speaker for a significant name implant companies. He owns 2 practices. How he manages to keep all this straight while still running a consulting firm named Rittenhouse Consulting Group and running his own Facebook group called Dental Nachos. Make sure you go check it out. It's hilarious. It's awesome.
It's great.
It's all Paul. Dental Nachos on Facebook. And to make matters even more funny, he has a history as a stand-up comedian. So round of applause for our good friend, Dr. Paul Goodman.
Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jayme. I just came for a Jayme Amos introduction. I'm going to go now. So I appreciate this. This is a great day, but I'm happy to be here, happy to contribute. I really, love helping dentists. I know it can be a difficult road at all different stages of your career, and I'm happy to just contribute and do what I can at any stage for dentists. So glad to be here.
Well,
Awesome.
This is really, really cool for me. I know I kind of holding the mic here for introductions, and the one that I would be remiss if I wasn't able to do well is we're kind of simul hosting or simul recording for the Ideal Practices podcast, and you guys all know, of course, you guys are wonderful listeners to Richard Lowe's podcast. Richard, may I?
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, the Shared Practices podcast.
So we keep threatening each other that we'll speak on each other's podcasts at one point in the future. I don't know if this officially counts because there's 4 of us on here. So, Richard, we're going to have to circle back again.
Yeah, I think so.
Guys, if anybody's listening, maybe on the Ideal Practices podcast where we'll post this. Guys, Richard is making waves. He is moving in the dental industry at a really cool pace. His podcast has turned a lot of heads. He has garnered a ton of attention, a lot of goodwill, a lot of good rapport, and a ton of respect. He's a 2015 grad from Midwestern, and he's got an AEGD program. He's with the Army in Fort Hood. Guys, he's a military doc who has created what I've seen as really high quality content. And I've had multiple expert speaker friends in the industry say, hey, have you bumped into Richard Lowe yet? You guys got to meet. So Dr. Richard Lowe, thank you for all you do, and thank you for contributing to dentistry like you have. It's an honor to be here on the Shared Practices podcast with you, and thank you for having me.
Well, thank all of you, and thank you for that huge intro. It's funny, when I was trying to name the podcast, it was so hard because there's like already so many good names. And you had Ideal Practices, and I was like, well, mine are just going to be shared. They're not necessarily ideal. We'll just share them and see what happens. So I'm not there quite yet. We're just sharing what we've got, and hopefully along the way, some people benefit. So thank you for that intro. To start this conversation off, let's go back to this Facebook conversation that we had. So Paul posted, I'd say maybe a week or 2 ago, maybe it was longer, asking people if before their current associateship or past associateship, if they had anyone look at it, if they had an attorney review that associateship contract, because of the impact that can have not only on their immediate job, but also their ability to, in the future, open their own practice, acquire a different practice, and really kind of break free and become an owner. And for this podcast, for the Shared Practices podcast, this is a little bit out of order. This is kind of a season 1 episode. And so we might even title it as a season one episode throwback. But I still get asked this question of like, what specific terms should I be looking out for? And what are the red flags in this or that associateship agreement? So I am so excited to have you all on and to be able to pick your brain. So maybe, Paul, I'll pass that back to you with kind of your thoughts when you posted that on Facebook.
Sure. So people have got a reputation. I love surveys. I love polls. When I lecture, I'm always asking dentists to vote. I mean, it's just something I enjoy. So I posted a poll about, what did they have an attorney review their contract? Did they not have an attorney review their contract? Did they not have a contract? And it really stimulated a lot of responses. And, boiled down to, I'd say, I think about 50% of the dentists out there and their current associates did have an attorney look at a contract, and 50% didn't. But in the comments section, which I thought was valuable, people were discussing, why they did or why they did not. And I think there might be perhaps a misconception among young associates that, it's a simple document, and if they read it and they can understand it, why would they need an attorney to review it? And what I tell my residents that I've connected with people like Rob, he's done some great work for us, you don't want to, just going to use a number, but like you don't want to not spend $600 for it to cost you $600,000 later in some problem. And also, one of the things is that, we've spent our whole life going to dental school, sometimes a residency, and, it's happened to me too. People just want to know what's next, where's the next thing I can apply to and fill out my application and make my personal statement and get a job. And there really sort of this wild west out there of the private practice world. And I think you want to start, with an agreement in the right direction. And I think not having someone take a look at it. I mean, to me, I tell the residents there's no bad outcome to it. Either someone like Rob looks at the agreement and may say that this is great and you're on the right track. That would make you feel good. But even better, if they say there's just a lot of problems here, it's good that you know it before you get started. Because I tell all the residents that, finding a job as an associate dentist, there's a lot of effort on both parties. Part the owner, the associate, there's a lot to do. So it's not really easy to undo it, nor do you want to do it 5 months in if it's not going well. So I think it's one of those things where it's better if I'm heading in the right direction to start with. So that was my incentive to post it. We got a lot of comments, and I know this was our idea for this, so I think that's awesome.
Well, Rob, you kind of mentioned briefly this idea that sometimes people just sign things. It's just like Paul was saying, you're getting used to put in your application for dental school, you put in your application for this, that, and the other, you sign all the documents, you get your loans. You can kind of get in this like, okay, it's just another check the box, let's sign this. Why is that a problem?
Well, for a number of reasons. I mean, overall, this is, and maybe it's interesting, I've never really thought about it in that context, that this might be really the first serious agreement that these people may be entering into. And they may not, and certainly they may not have gone down the road before to see what what could happen if you sign something without understanding it, or what it means to sign a contract. Because when there's a problem, even if an agreement is presented in a really low key way, and it's just an agreement, just a formality. But when there's a dispute, that agreement gets pulled out and paraded around, and it is the thing. And what you agreed to and what you signed off on it becomes very real. And so until I think you've seen something go wrong, you may not have an appreciation for what it means to actually sign it on the dotted line.
Okay. So having that awareness of what you're doing is important and can get you in trouble. So let's talk about some specific areas that people maybe regret having signed something. And I'd love if you guys have some examples, because you guys have seen a lot of the good and the bad of this. Non-competes is kind of one of those default questions that everyone goes to. So what is like the worst non-compete you've ever seen, and why is that such a big problem?
Here's a concept. It's called the Olympic ring theory. So you can imagine the Olympic rings, how those 5 rings kind of overlap.
Yeah.
So there are some associateship contracts that exclude you from all of their locations. So imagine those Olympic rings sitting over top of a map. you could think that you're signing a non-compete radius that just applies to one of those little circles, meaning one of the non-compete radii or radius of that specific location. You could think you're just dealing with one ring. But many group practices will, I think, kind of sneakily get into their contracts the exclusion from all of their locations, effectively eliminating you from the entire Olympic ring image on that map. And in some cases, that could quite literally kick you out of your own state, where you literally can't practice or own a practice or practice for anybody else in your entire state. So I think that's really scary. And for those, that might sound simple, but guys, please don't overlook the necessity to have somebody who's looked at hundreds and hundreds of these contracts to make sure yours doesn't have something that simple missed in your contract, because it could penalize you in very harmful ways. Okay, great. So that was a nightmare scenario. What's some other scenarios that you guys have seen, Paul and Rob, in terms of maybe a single office or multiple offices and a crappy non-compete?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen so many. Obviously, a number of miles that's excessive is a problem. What Jayme just said is absolutely real. When you start looking at taking the compass out and doing a 10 or 15 mile radius around 10 or 15 different locations, you're talking about literally thousands and thousands of square miles that you're agreeing to not practice. And after you spend all the time and money that you do as a dentist and a recent grad to get the education, to get the license, to be able to practice a profession, you really need to guard and be careful about giving up your right to practice in a willy-nilly way. And I think, these things, and a lot of times when we lecture on this topic to young dentists or residents or dental students, people ask, they say, well, are these things, we're told that these things aren't really enforceable, and, would a court ever enforce it? And, the reality is, to find that out, whether or not one of these things is enforceable, means you've had a trial. And if you've had a trial, you could easily have spent six figures in attorney's fees to quote unquote win. And, I don't think that that's a fight that most young dentists can afford to fight. And so, I would never say that we walk out of a courtroom after spending, $100,000 plus, winning, quote unquote, winning a non-compete case to say, hey, now you're allowed to practice within 10 miles instead of 15 of that location. But the big thing, I think, it's more than just the extreme examples of some of these things that bad ones and bad non-competes. Where I see it's really harmful is the effect that could have on your future. So when you look at these non-competes, and you could say, well, what can I do? Can I try to get this invalidated in court? Maybe. But the practical effect of this is that you're not going to be able to get a loan to buy a practice or do a startup practice in that restricted area. So even if you went and said, hey, this non-compete that's got a 20-mile radius from around 5 different offices, 4 of them I've never even worked in, that's never going to be enforceable. This is crazy. Everybody tells me it's not going to be enforceable. Lawyers have told me this is fine. This is a case I could win. When you go for financing and you're trying to get approved to do, like I said, your startup or your acquisition, the bank's going to look at that stuff from an underwriting standpoint, and they might say, yeah, we agree. You probably win this case. But we're not giving you $550,000 for your startup to find out the sheriff is going to show up on opening day and close the practice down. That's one of the things that you have to be aware of. And this goes to the awareness topic that we talked about briefly before, which is, do you understand the ramifications of agreeing to something like that? It's not just that, hey, maybe I won't be able to work, and or maybe I'll push the limits and see if they actually come after me. It's no, I'm not going to be able to choose my path to ownership, perhaps. I'm not going to be able to buy a practice or start up anywhere in this whole area. And as Jayme said, it can mean you might have to leave the state or leave the area where you live and where your family is entrenched. So that's sort of one of the examples that I find that's troubling. It's really not necessarily the specific terms of the non-compete, but the impact that it can have on your future.
Our mission at Shared Practices is to help you navigate the path to practice ownership. But one complaint that I've gotten, or one sentiment that I've heard, is that it's a seller's market right now, and it's hard to find practices, and practices fly off the shelf pretty quick. And so people say, like, well, I can't own a practice because I can't find a good practice to buy. Like, I'm willing to go different places. I'm willing to expand my search, but I just can't find good practices. So George has found a way to bring some of these good practices to our attention. So George, share with us what you're doing now with these practices.
So I've reached out to brokers and I've searched nationwide for practice opportunities that fit the criteria that we discuss on the podcast for the kinds of things you're looking for. And so I went ahead and contacted all these brokers and I got these practices back, and I'm posting them to our listings page on our website in a way that only our listeners will know how to understand based on what we teach in the podcast. And I think it'll highlight the financial opportunities that are out there that other buyers may not notice.
So like things like profitability and hygiene ratios. Do we even have EBITDA on there?
I did EBITDA for every practice that's on there.
Awesome. And if they don't meet certain criteria, we're not going to list them. So we've already done a basic filtering for you. And if there's not a practice on there that's in your area, what are you doing about that, George?
Well, we're still growing. You know, it's definitely a work in progress to get all these opportunities up there. It's definitely a lot of my time. So if there's an area that you're interested in, email me and let me know where you're looking to buy and kind of when. And then I will go out and try to find something for you using our podcast as a way to getting these practices and posting them online, and then obviously letting you know directly.
Awesome. And as a caveat, you still are going to have to do all of your own due diligence and understand and go through and have these looked at by professionals. But this is definitely providing our listeners with a phenomenal starting point of practices for them to potentially own and make offers on and move into practice ownership a whole lot sooner. So this is awesome. Thank you, George.
You're very welcome. I just thought this was a fantastic way to do a pre-screening and just knock out all of the things that we're not interested in based on what we teach on the podcast and really focus on the specific criteria. And that criteria is posted on that website. So just go to sharedpractices.com, click on practice opportunities on the upper right, and you'll see all of our listings. And the way that they're laid out is by financial information only.
Awesome.
Yeah, Rob, what you're saying there, kind of that six-figure loss just to win, that reminds me of the old saying, the easiest way to lose an argument is to win on principle.
Yeah. We refer to that as the dreaded P word in our office.
The principle.
I do it on principle. That's not, yeah.
So here's one for you. Richard, do you mind if I toss out another thing that people could look out for in contracts?
Well, one thing, so I like to, as much as sometimes it's hard to give specifics, we talked about kind of a bad non-compete. What would be maybe a reasonable, and I know it's going to be a range, it's going to depend on the density if you're in a metro versus rural, but for like a dense metro and for a rural setting, what would be, this is a non-awful non-compete. This is something you can live with and be happy with, or at least a range.
Well, it kind of depends on your goals, right? I mean, there's no inherent good in a mileage radius. You know, I think there is a better for the specific goals of that practice owner. I'm actually very impressed. I'm deeply impressed when I hear of doctors who for the last 6 months or 2 years have been driving an hour and a half to their associateship every day. Not because I applaud them for the commute, but I applaud them in the cases where for their specific situation, their specific vision, they say, I know I want to own a practice in this community where I'm living or pretty darn close to it. Therefore, I'm going to drive an hour and a half commute every day so I can have an associateship. So I think, forgive me if this sounds too ethereal, but I don't think there's an actual mileage that is better.
Sure.
0 is good.
0 is great.
I think that the real question is, what are your goals? What is your desire?
Sure.
What vision are you hoping for, like Rob said, to protect your future? I think that's what's best, is a solution that's in alignment with your future. And that's where people like Rob or Paul come in with such brilliance. And if I may say, even the team at Ideal Practices with startups, we look at the future first. We look at the predetermined reverse engineering process of that future goal and then come up with solutions today to match that future expectation. So I know that's not a mileage radius.
I'll take it. You guys didn't give me a specific bad one, and you didn't give me a specific good one, but I'll forgive you all, and we can move on. No, I'm just kidding.
Can I give you another one that surprised me when I saw it just recently?
Yeah, let's see it.
So one of the biggest corporate groups in America was employing one of our high-level consulting clients in the Midwest, and my jaw kind of hit the floor when I saw one of the requirements for the permission to use his imagery. Essentially, it was a couple pages worth of legal language that said we the corporate big chain with hundreds of locations, we're allowed to use your image for anything we want forever.
What?
It's a version of a media release, a version of paperwork, and this. I'm not an attorney, so Rob, I'm sure you've seen things like this, and you could define it better than I. But the short of it is, I, the doctor, as part of my employment agreement, I am agreeing for you, the corporate chain, to use my picture for whatever the heck you want to use it for as long as you want to use it.
For all eternity. Wow.
Right. And this guy, I'm so glad that was struck from his contract because he wanted to open up a practice 20 miles to the east of where that was. I mean, it's okay if he uses his own face in his postcards too, but how unfortunate if the corporate chain right down the street is still allowed to use his big smile on their postcards 20 miles away. All right.
That's awful. Rob, what have you seen with that and kind of media release and image? Is that a rare circumstance, or is that something that's come up before?
It is rare, but you really see it's all over the map as to what you can expect in an associate agreement, because there is no uniform agreement, obviously. So it's really, every time I pick one up and review one for a young associate, there's almost inevitably there's going to be something new in there that, like, oh, where'd that one come from? So it doesn't surprise me. People, it depends who create these documents. They cut and paste. They may take an agreement from some other industry, and that's the person that originally did that template, and they brought in that somebody said, yeah, we need some language on that, and they cut and paste that from some document that maybe is appropriate in that industry. And it just you can never assume that what is in the agreement is appropriate, I think, is the overall thing. And I think what Jayme was saying before as to the mileage and what's reasonable, really, I agree with him completely with that. I mean, and I think this is really a theme, Richard, that you espouse too, which is it's not one size fits all.
No.
None of this stuff is.
Yeah.
It depends. I can tell you that what is legally probably a reasonable mileage or distance in Philadelphia, might be from the Schuylkill River to the Delaware River. What is the center city area, or in New York City, it's probably maybe 20 or 30 blocks. In a suburban area, maybe 15 miles or 10 miles. In a more rural area, maybe it's 20 to 30. But none of that matters, because what really matters is, as Jayme said, what are your goals? And if your goals are to own a practice in that area where you're agreeing to be restricted, then that's a problem for you. And that's what you need to understand at the outset. What impact are those mileage or those distances going to have on me? Not whether or not in the vacuum they're a problem. I mean, that just becomes a theoretical exercise. What impact is that going to have on you? And when we counsel young clients, I talk to them and ask them about their situation. Where are they going to work? Why are they going to work there? Is that where they grew up? Do they see themselves practicing there for the rest of their careers? And if somebody has a lousy non-compete and they tell me that they're only going to be living there for 2 miles while their spouse is finishing up their residency, then who cares?
Sure.
You're going to leave town. But tell me that you're moving to that area and agreeing to a lousy non-compete, and that your uncle is a general dentist and he's going to be able to refer to you as a specialist, and that's where you want to do a startup or acquire a practice someday, then we're going to have a serious conversation about what that lousy 20-mile non-compete is going to have on you. So it's a case-by-case basis. It's not one size fits all.
And that I really appreciate that you and Jayme drove that home, because that is the specific answer that people need, is that they need to evaluate what their specific future goals are and how this non-compete right now would affect that. And that's the answer. So I'm glad we drilled down to that and kind of brought it back. So thank you guys for that.
I just want to chime in, because it's awesome that I know you have a lot of dental students, listening to your podcast. Rob and Jayme, especially Jayme, helping people realize their dream, which is just awesome. But he's dealing, Jayme, you're dealing with dentists who are coming to you for a reason, realize their dream, open up a practice. But if you think of, whether it's practice acquisition or a startup as marriage, and then, could be a lot of dating in between there. So it's not just about, that will prevent you from a startup or an acquisition. If you're in a certain area, many of the people that maybe come to you, Jayme, they've had 4 or 5 different associateships before they get there. So you have to really try to think about, is this going to be a good position for me? Because associates change very rapidly, and a lot of dentists nowadays have roots, whether it's they own a home or they have children, and they're not even quite even at the practice purchase or startup stage, but they actually need to get another place of employment. And if they're limited in where they are, that can be a very stressful thing for them and their family. So I tell a lot of the residents sometimes, I know they're disheartened, but it's better just not to take a job that's going to be a problem and try to get out of it versus not taking it at all. So that's important for your dental students to know too.
That's so powerful. That's kind of that old concept of let's prepare wisely for the next couple decades, not the next couple years.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So let's go into some more specifics. You guys had mentioned this idea of having to give notice of when you were going to leave a specific job or associateship and how that can impact you. So what would be an unfortunate term or agreement that would be preventing you from departing a practice effectively?
I think there's actually 2 issues that kind of come up in that context. The one is just how many days do you have to give, notice. And a lot of times that would be reciprocal. So the employer may have to give you 60, maybe you have to give them 60. Sometimes, though, you may see a situation where an employer is going to require a longer notice period, say 120 days. I've seen agreements where it says, though, that after the employee gives the employer 120 days notice, the employer could turn around and fire them on the spot. Which, if you're looking to do a startup or an acquisition, you're more than likely, where you should be, mapping out kind of what's going to happen in that period leading up to when you open up your practice. And you're going to time the notice that you're giving to your employer based on certain dates and time frames that are happening with your project or your acquisition. And you may not be factoring in the fact that you may be unemployed for 4 months leading up to the opening of your practice or your acquisition, which could have an impact on your financing or your cash flow for sure. So that's something to be careful about. The other thing that we see is a lot of times if you have an agreement where an associate's being paid a percentage of collections, what happens to that compensation after the person is no longer working there and the money continues to come in from insurance reimbursement. So if you're being paid 35% of collections, and their obligation to pay you, the employer's obligation to pay you ends on the day that you leave the practice, what happens with all those PPO monies that are going to come in for the next 60 days after you're there? Essentially that means you kind of work for free the last 2 months that you were in your job, which again, cash flow and if you're buying a practice or doing a startup is key, and if you're going to go into that planning that I'm going to have liquidity, I'm going to have so much X number of dollars in the bank because I'm going to continue to work up into this date, or I'm going to continue to get salary up until a certain point. You want to make sure that that's in fact what you're entitled to under the agreement. And it may not be something that you think about when you're signing the contract, but that stuff is in there and you have to be aware of it. And that's something that, while there are a number of provisions that are difficult to negotiate, and obviously an associate doesn't have a ton of bargaining power oftentimes in these situations, but there are certain things that they do. And I always tell people, I don't think it's unreasonable for the employer to have to pay you for the work that you do. And if that means that they have to continue to give you money after you're no longer working there because you're being paid on collections and that money's rolling in, then you should ask them for that. And if they have a problem with that, you may want to think about whether or not this is the right place for you to work.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. Well, first, my initial thought to that was 120 days seems so long, especially if you didn't like the practice. It's not working out to have to hang out for 4 months. That just seems awful. And it makes sense. They're trying to protect themselves and have time to find an associate, but then to have them being able to flip-flop on you and then fire you immediately would be even worse. So
I'd like to throw this out, Richard, too. Making it even worse than that, this one agreement I actually looked at last week, that was the exact scenario.
Yeah.
Except on top of that, there was a penalty of $1,000 a day for each day that they didn't give notice.
Oh.
So it's really
that's
it's
exciting.
Yeah.
So I think it would be important for all dentists to realize that the associateship contract, like this is just a little bit of tough love. The associateship contract is not there to protect the associate.
Right.
The associateship contract is there to protect the practice.
Absolutely.
And I know there are a lot of associates who want to kind of bend the associateship agreement to benefit them, and I can understand that. I'd probably want to do the same. But the employer, if you look at it from their perspective, the employer is the responsible party to provide services related to healthcare for those patients, and that employer, rightfully so, should exercise very rigorous protections to do that. And that's unfortunate for the associate because it might not fit their goals. But I think looking at it from that perspective, some of this stuff can be understandable even if it's not beneficial to the associate.
I think that's like an incredibly important point to realize, because I try to help my associates understand. I hope that they're owners someday too, wherever they want to be owners, wherever they want to go, and hopefully they learn some valuable things along the way from me and my brother as owners. But I think one of the things that we've been discussing a lot on the message boards now, not just in Hacks, is like this corporate versus non-corporate. But I think the word corporate is too loaded. I like this when I talk to someone and say, are they going to see the owner dentist, or are they not going to see the owner dentist? The owner is ever going to be around, sometimes going to be around. And so the relationship you have with the owner dentist, and they don't have to sit side by side with you every day, doing fillings, but from the beginning part, in terms of who interviews you, who talks to you, who manages the relationship, I think the more often you see the owner dentist and get to know them, you're going to develop what's hopefully a positive relationship and share some of your life goals. Nowadays, which I think is awesome, it's very common for a dentist to be married to a doctor of either gender, and doctors have incredibly long training periods. So you may have an associate whose spouse is doing a 5-year residency, and then they're going to be moving to the West Coast, and that's important to know in general. And I think that if you have a shared understanding, I know that's ideal. Using one of your words, ideal. But I think when associates are in positions where they're just not seeing, communicating, or talking to the owner dentist on a frequent basis, then a lot of these challenging things come into play.
Hey, can I follow up on that, Paul? I think that's a good point, and that kind of translates into an issue that we were talking about earlier, that you really need to know who you're working for. There needs to be a relationship. A contract is not a substitute for a relationship. It's not a substitute for trust. If you have a good feeling about the person and the contract's consistent, that's great. But if you don't have a good sense of who you're going to work for, or you know that the person is not reputable, or you don't trust them, there's nothing that you could put in an agreement or in a contract that's going to change that. And it's really about getting to know and understanding your situation and developing that relationship, and that's paramount. The agreement's just a ticket to a lawsuit. That's the document that you attach to the complaint.
Sure.
It's not, and people will say like, oh, I don't really trust this guy. Let's make sure the contract's really written well. I'm like, well, wait a second. Why are you doing this if you don't trust this person on the other side? I don't have that kind of power. We're lawyers. We can't change people's behavior by what we put in a contract.
And that's a great Rob Montgomery soundbite. He has another one that I say all the time, and I'll just repurpose it, is that, people don't usually get more reasonable. So if they start off unreasonable for whatever reason, and that's so wonderful to think about, because what I would like to tell your listeners, dentists, anyone is like, Jayme, your background, Rob, your background, it's just so much different than ours as dentists. People talk about the business world. I don't want to call it the business world, but we have no experience in this. And even when you're a practice owner for a long time, you still don't have that experience. So these advisors that you have on your team are bringing you a lot of real world experience you don't have. And that's why I value what Rob and Jayme help me with, but especially those Rob Montgomery sound bites, because they come from a lot of real world experience of things that haven't gone well. So I think that listeners need to realize that these people are here to guide you in the right direction. And if you don't have a good vibe about your owner dentist, you're probably not going to ever get a good vibe. So that's a real point.
Well, Paul, to your point, Paul, I think Rob and I could have a little chuckle about this. There's this common phrase out there in contract negotiations between the signer and the signee, and the phrase is, "Oh, it's just a standard agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and sign it."
Mm-hmm.
Right? The person who wants you to sign the agreement, the employer or the seller of real estate or the landlord, what have you, oftentimes we laugh because clients will come to us and say, well, they said it's a standard agreement, so it must be okay. Well, guys, buyer beware. There's no such thing. There is zero such thing as a standard agreement. It doesn't exist. And even if it did exist, it doesn't mean it's inherently good. So standard agreement is one topic. The other topic that I could toss out there for everybody, Richard, do you mind if I give a very practical when to tell your employer if you're going to be leaving, kind of a benchmarked concept since we're talking about the employment agreement?
Yeah, I'd love that.
So here's a little kind of real actionable thing. If you're thinking about doing a startup or an acquisition, my strong recommendation is to not say a word to your employer at your associateship until you have a secured signature on real estate and or a firm opening date from construction.
Okay.
So why is that? So we use that as a benchmark because there's that kind of delicate balance between making sure you're ethically and honorably doing the right thing by your employment contract. That's important. And ethically and honorably acting as a professional in your community, the people you're providing care for, the people you're serving. But we also need to make sure to protect your future and practice ownership. So if you were to tell, imagine this, imagine you go to your employer and a few months after signing the papers and working for the practice, you say, hey, employer, guess what? Someday, I'm going to quit. And someday I'm going to retire because someday I'll do that. Well, that would be silly, right?
Yeah.
You don't talk about that. You don't talk about quitting or retiring until you actually have a firm plan to do that. So you dreaming about a startup or you imagining an acquisition or even looking at practices to buy or looking at demographic studies to go find a town, those things don't mean you have a firm plan in place. So I would say to find the proper balance about when to tell your employer, use that simple benchmark of not until you have a signed piece of paper on your real estate, lease or purchase. So signed piece of paper on your real estate and or a firm opening for a target construction date for your grand opening.
Awesome.
If you were a startup.
And to bring that back to an acquisition, would you say an LOI is good enough for an acquisition, or do you still think that like the real estate lease kind of closing type documents are more important?
I think acquisition, if you're talking about an acquisition of a practice, you wait until you have a signed asset purchase agreement.
Yeah, the LOI is non. I mean,
it's not non-binding.
You can make this official, but it's non-binding on anybody. It's really just one more piece of dream paperwork. So, yeah, I would say wait until you sign stuff that is irreversible.
Okay, perfect.
Absolutely.
Did you have anything else on that, Rob? I didn't want to cut you off there.
No, I totally agree. An enforceable agreement and even something that's signed, but something that doesn't have outs or bad contingencies. That's something that you have, confidence, or your advisors have confidence is actually going to come to fruition.
Another great course that I found on speareducation.com is a course on how practices grow. Naturally, when we open our practice at first, we're focused on growth. And over time, if we don't think about it, sometimes that growth can stagnate. Here's Imtiaz Manji.
Now, everyone chooses their level of success because it's discretionary to them. And so oftentimes what will happen is we will choose a level of success and we'll drive towards it, and then we will go into this comfort zone. Then our comfort zone is where we are, and it's not a bad thing. And I'm not saying you have a bad practice. I'm just saying you're in your comfort zone. You're not growing anymore, and you almost do it subconsciously. You kind of just are programmed by the systems you put in place, and those systems then hold you back, and you drive those systems out of habit, and you remain at that level. And oftentimes the reason that occurs is there is no urgency. Thinking about it is not part of your DNA. Choosing success each day that I become successful, it's something that I've chosen to do. I want to be more successful at it.
This course goes through 5 levels of practice growth and how we can improve in each of those areas, from clinical to our office organization and systems, to the cases and the acceptance that we get on those cases, and then the vision of our practice, and eventually even the facilities. The course has handouts, calculators, exercises. It's a phenomenal 2.5-hour course that you could run through as an office over the period of a couple months and understand how and where you've stagnated and what you can do to improve. For access to this course and hundreds more like it, go to speareducation.com and request an extended guest pass when you mention the Shared Practices podcast. Use the promo code LOW200 to get $200 off your annual membership when you sign up. Okay, so one thing we mentioned with that giving notice in 120 days and the getting paid on collections and then they're collecting down the road, this is going to show my naivete of how these things actually happen. We typically get paid on collections rather than production, or at least that's what owners would want to pay you on. Would it ever be possible to set up an agreement where you're paid on the average of the practice's collections for that month? So say you produced X that month, and that in the contract you said historically our collections have been at about 96%, 97%. And so you then take that off, you include any insurance write-offs and then take off that percentage and then get paid that flat amount rather than waiting for the money to trickle in. Or is it almost always you have to wait for the insurance to be reimbursed and the patients to pay for you as an associate to get paid?
It's almost always that you'd have to wait to get paid. There is one big national practice that has sort of like a pool along the lines of what you're talking about, where the revenue goes into a pool that the associates in the office split the profit from that as part of their incentive compensation. But yeah, there are other ways to deal with it too. I mean, some people do get paid on a production basis. It's not as common. And, this is actually, it's okay. This kind of works, but it's just a matter of, knowing that the agreement says that you're entitled to it, or that kind of how much money you should be entitled to, or you have some kind of idea. I think we were talking about earlier, we can put something in an agreement that says that you'll have access to your to the records to audit whether or not you've been paid sufficiently. But these are things that you need to be, you have to take self-help and do yourself and make copies of daily sheets and production reports and know roughly how much money you think you should be entitled to. And you have to be diligent as you go along the process. If you don't keep track of that stuff and then you're out of there and over the 60 days after you've left, you're not happy and you have no idea how much money you're entitled to receive, you're kind of in a bad place. And I've had those conversations with associates where they leave a job and they say, these people haven't paid me. Well, how much money do you think you're entitled to? I have no idea. Well, how much we're going to ask them for? I don't know. And then there have been times where we've actually made demands on employers and then they come back and they show us a reconciliation and say, we don't owe them anything. In fact, it looks like they may owe us some money.
It's an interesting thing that happens, especially in a general practice, because we are like the diner of the dental world. We offer like everything you want out there. You want a denture adjustment, you want a filling, you want a crown. So I have 2 associates. So as an owner, this is speaking as an owner, I like to make sure, and then this is what I believe in, that I believe my associates should have a daily guarantee for their entire time there so that they can, pay their bills, pay their expenses. And then in the agreement Rob had made for our associates, we talked about reconciling quarterly. I may even push that to reconciling twice a year because it's actually a lot of work on the office manager, the owners to try to figure out these pay. And like what Rob just shared, that, an owner said, hey, actually we may, be short and you may owe us money. So it's more challenging than it seems, especially in a general practice with multiple providers and a lot of insurance checks coming in. So I think that one way to avoid that, Richard, for someone is if they do have a daily guarantee, they know they're at least getting that, and hopefully they're getting some type of bonus on top of that, but not having anything taken away. So owners may disagree with me, but I just believe in that.
One of the takeaways, and thank you for that. That's perfect. One of the things I'm going to encourage people to do because of this is that if you are thinking about doing a startup or an acquisition in the next 6 months to a year, start keeping meticulous track of your production, collections, and what you've been paid for multiple reasons. One, so that you can show lenders, hey, this is what I can produce, and here's documentation to support that. And then so that once you leave that employer, you know that, okay, I expect to have this much money coming in afterwards. And you brought that up, Rob, that this actually works out. And I think that it can work out in someone's favor to be paid this way because it gives you a little bit of income past the time that you've stopped working. So if there is a little bit of lag time, that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you know what to expect, what's coming in, and you can go back to them if you think there's something wrong. This has been really good. So was there anything else with compensation or perks that you guys thought we should bring up? And one of them that I see people ask a lot about is if they're being paid as like a 1099 versus a W-2 employee as an associate. And I wanted to hear your guys' thought on that. And specifically, Rob, kind of what you recommend that people try and get, or if it's really just up to the owner and what they're going to pay you as.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole session on that topic. I think there's a misconception from a lot of people that it's better to be an independent contractor as an associate.
And let me ask you to do something for me. Can you describe the difference of what it means to be an independent contractor, 1099 employee versus a W-2 employee for someone who's like, this is their first job because they've been undergrad in the dental school and they really haven't ever worked for themselves or someone else?
Yeah. So an employer or W-2 relationship is what we all know to be a job. You go to work every day. Somebody tells you what you need to do. They supervise you. They provide the tools and the facility for you to practice, and you have to answer to them essentially. An independent contractor is somebody that just comes in like a free agent, and they don't have to. Nobody tells them what to do. They set their own schedule. They come and go as they please. They set their own standards. They may bring their own equipment. Sort of the easy analogy is the IT guy in an office. The IT guy shows up. They fix their thing. You pay them and they leave. They're not employees of yours. But where somebody that is coming to work every day and is being told basically how to perform their job and their duties, that's an employee. There are very few, and as you hear that, you're probably thinking, well, then how could there be an independent contractor in the dental world?
Yeah.
And the answer to that question is there really shouldn't be in most contexts. So an example of an independent contractor in the dental world might be an oral surgeon who works in 5 different practices, and every day she's at a different practice. She brings her assistants, brings her own equipment. Really operates independently and autonomously from the rest of the office. You may see an orthodontist, perhaps, that may float around to different general dentistry practices or pedo practices. They're arguably independent contractors. But if somebody's working as an associate in a general dentistry office 2-3 days a week or even more, they're probably an employee. And where that designation comes into play, well, it's a couple of ways that are significant. The first is as a 1099 or an independent contractor, the employer is not withholding taxes. So there's a higher degree of planning that goes into that. So if you're an employee, the employer takes out your income taxes and pays it to the government, and at the end of the year, you get your W-2 and you see how much money was withheld from your check and how much you made and how much you owe. And that number should be, just about break even. Maybe you have to pay a few bucks or you get a few bucks back.
Sure.
If you're an independent contractor who just made $100,000 this past year, well, you may owe $35,000 on income tax.
Yeah.
For that. And zero has been withheld. So
and now you owe interest on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. And while you've been going out and collecting $100,000, you went out and you leased a really nice car, you took some nice vacations, then all of a sudden you get this bill from the IRS, and whoa, where's this going to come from? That's one thing so to keep in mind. The other thing that's material is that as an independent contractor, you may end up having to pay what's known as self-employment tax.
Yeah.
And that's really both sides of FICA. So as opposed to being responsible for your share of Social Security and Medicare, roughly, 6.5%, or I should say 7.5%, you are responsible for both sides of that, 7.5% that you would have paid and the employer side. So at the end of the day, you have that additional tax liability, even if you're able to run some expenses through as a result of this relationship, set this off against your income. It's quite likely that you'll not be in as good a position if you would have been an employee who didn't have that opportunity. So the self-employment tax is a real thing that a lot of people don't factor into. I think there's kind of a misconception that, I can expense things. I can expense my cell phone or a portion of my car. Well, maybe you can. Those things probably won't add up to what the liability is for being paid that way. But
and as an associate, you don't have expenses in the same way that an owner has expenses that you're writing off, and there isn't as many advantages to be able to take in your tax code, and as an associate, you just can't use that to your advantage as much as an owner can.
No, you can't. It's true. And certainly not legitimate ones, right? So,
right.
Yeah, you can put anything through if you want, but it doesn't mean that it's appropriate or legal. The other thing that we see from time to time in independent contractor agreements that's a real big problem is that employers may ask, or calling employers, the practice may be asking the independent contractor to indemnify them for any liability for this misclassification of them as an independent contractor. And what that means is, if the government looks at this and says, employer, you misclassified these people, they should have been an employee where you withheld payroll tax and FICA and unemployment and paid workers' comp. However, you've improperly characterized them as an independent contractor. There could be significant fines and penalties associated with that. So seeing an agreement where it says that you're going to indemnify the employer for that, indemnification is an insurance concept. It means you're going to cover them for that, just like your car insurance carrier indemnifies you if you're in an accident. So when you agree to indemnify your employer for that misclassification, you're agreeing to insure them in case the government comes after them for fines and penalties for this misclassification, which they
So not only are you paying more in taxes, you have to plan your taxes better because they're not automatically withholding. You're probably not getting any benefits in terms of medical or retirement or other benefits they may be offering other employees of the practice. But now they want you to pay for them misclassifying you if the government were to come after them. So it's like they're forcing you to take the 1099, which you probably don't want, and then bail them out if they get in trouble for it.
Exactly. Doesn't sound so good, does it?
No, not at all. So what do you do? And I guess it comes down to, if they want you to be a 1099 independent contractor, but you're working there 4 or 5 days a week, and that's your only office where you're working, but that's what they're offering, you don't have much leverage. So I guess what do you do about that? You just make sure that you're not indemnified and realize what you're getting into and plan accordingly?
Exactly. If there's indemnification in that agreement, that's something that I really kind of jump up and down with clients on and say, look, this is risky, it's dangerous, be careful. But, and that's something I think that it's reasonable to try to get eliminated. And a lot of times the practices and the dentist, that's the employer, doesn't even know that that's in there or understand what the ramifications are. That's just something that their lawyer cooked up and stuck in there, And then, when we go back, we start, and the associate has the conversation with them about why it's not okay. A lot of times they'll take it out, because they never intended for it to be in there in the first place. They don't even know what it meant. Didn't even know what it meant. So, but that's something that is a problem. That's almost a threshold issue that you got to really be careful about. But beyond that, then you just have to know what you're agreeing to, plan accordingly, and make sure that you're putting money away to cover the taxes, and deal with the economics of that relationship. But you don't want to be exposed from a liability standpoint above and beyond.
And one thing, Jayme, you had mentioned that I know the agreements are in there to protect the employer, but just from a logistical standpoint, since I'm like currently, missing text messages right now on who wants a job or who needs a job, or because this is the time, right? July 1st is when the residencies end, and the dentists think that, I can magically sometimes produce a job in 3 weeks, which is not possible. And it's a lot of moving during this time, with dentists going to different programs and replacing associates. That's happening to us. But I would encourage your listeners, if there's a contract available, to start reviewing with someone like Rob before, with enough time to discuss or make changes prior to the start date. Because the owner dentist, they want to get you started on that date to see patients, to replace their resident, replace their surgeon on a perio program. And if you start discussing this 3 days before that date, it throws everyone into some chaos. So I think it's important to try to get the agreements with enough time to make some comments and changes before this intended start date.
Okay, cool. Well, that's some really good specific advice. Is there any other surrounding compensation, surrounding perks, benefits of the job, anything else that is reasonable to ask for in the contract versus, yeah, it would be great if I could get all of my CE and all these other perks put in the contract, but that might not necessarily happen. So what would be a reasonable compensation and perks that you could fit into that contract?
I think the one thing that employees discount, whether it's an associate dentist or even just your team, is the contributions you make for their health insurance. So there's, as owners have to know a lot of interesting rules about, waiting periods, when you can offer, and you have to manage your associates' expectations, such as if they're at a hospital residency program and you have a 60-day waiting period for your health insurance, they're going to have COBRA for 2 months. But also for associates, realize that there is a contribution. I'm just going to use the example of $300 a month towards the health insurance contribution on the office plan, that is part of their compensation. And that is the same as being paid $3,600 a year as someone who doesn't have it. So there's some value-added things that come with positions that don't always just show up in your W-2 every other week. Okay,
cool. Rob, Jayme, any other thoughts on compensation before we wrap this up?
I feel like it's kind of it's a little like if you were house hunting and somebody said, what kind of house should I look for? The answer is, well, I don't know. I mean, I kind of like this kind of house. What kind of house do you like?
Sure.
I think, sure, anything could be asked for, and so much of it is dependent on what the employer is currently offering their other employees. Because if they don't have a 401k plan set up, it's probably going to be pretty hard to ask for one. If they don't have any health insurance stuff set up, well, it's probably going to be pretty tricky to get that from them, right? So I think so much of it is case specific that it's hard to give any from my humble perspective. I feel like it's hard to give rules of thumb because it's that broad. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with Jayme on that. It really is. If the practice is set up to do a certain thing from a benefit standpoint, or what the compensation is, it's hard to get beyond that, and you have to get comfortable with the fact that it's just a good opportunity and that it fits you. I do have one more thing I just want to comment on that's really not compensation related. And this goes for associate agreements, leases, buy-ins, asset purchase agreements, anything that you do with a lawyer. I think it's really important for you to be engaged and to know what's going on, to be focused, and to have a dialogue with your advisor so that they understand what's important to you. They understand the lay of the land. You can't expect, just to turn over any agreement to the lawyer and for them just to magically know what's important to you and what could be a problem, what your expectations are, what your understanding is as to what should be in there. You don't have to understand all the ins and outs of the legalities of certain things, but you should be comfortable in understanding what the risks are, what the business terms are. And the more focused and engaged you are in the process, the better the outcome will be. And it's just like your listeners in the dental profession. If you need a patient to be compliant, a patient has to cooperate and follow through with the treatment plan that you prescribe for them. You can't there's certain things you just can't create yourself. It's the same thing when you're dealing with a lawyer. We can do a better job for a client when that client is focused on the ball, asking us questions, telling us what their situation is all about, why certain things are important to them. The more we know and learn from them, and the more input we get from them, the better job we're going to be able to do for them. Because again, it's not one size fits all. And we can look at any agreement in a vacuum and say, this is good about it or this is bad about it. But to make sure that it's right for that person, we need to know what's important to them and what they think they should be getting. And then that's when we can really deliver an outstanding product.
That's so awesome. Good. I think the engagement thing, Rob, is so awesome. Guys, Richard, if you're listeners, or guys, if you're listening on the Ideal Practices podcast, if you're listening to this and like Rob is saying, you kind of would like to play a backseat role in being engaged and being involved, I think you could accidentally be shortchanging your own future. I think through Rittenhouse Consultants or through Montgomery Law, I think if you are able to help create the final goal and the solution, I think that's just as important as the specific custom advice from the advisor who you're asking to help. Because usually your advisors, if they're worth their salt, if you help them understand and if you co-create a destination, a proverbial destination, if you guys co-create the destination and get really clear on the destination, then your advisor can create a custom solution to get you there. But until you know, if you're going on a vacation, until you know you're going to Hawaii, it's pretty hard to have anybody give you advice on what airfare or what hotel, because without the destination, where do we start? So in alignment with the engagement topic, I think work with your advisor to co-create that destination, the end result or the goal first, and then allow them to fill in the gaps between here and there.
Totally agree, Jayme. And at the end of the day, we're advisors, and we're not decision makers, as we've talked about before. And we can advise people as to what we think is best or what they can do. But if they're not informed and focused enough to make a good decision based on our advice, they're definitely hurting themselves.
Awesome. That kind of wraps everything up for us. Thank you guys so much for being on the show. I think that this has raised awareness for any future associate, whether that's a new grad, someone who's still in dental school, or someone who's moving on to their next associateship and maybe realized, I didn't do this perfectly last time. We're going to have contact information for all of you guys in the show notes. So you guys, if you have further questions, if you want to hire Jayme to help you with a startup, if you want to bring Rob on to look at an agreement, or if you want Paul to broker your practice, or you just want some nachos on Facebook, go on the Facebook Dental Nachos page. So thank you guys so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you for all you're doing, Richard. With what you're doing with the Shared Practices podcast and what you're doing, it's really cool to see the waves you're making. So thank you for all you're doing to help support docs. This is really cool.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Talk to you soon. George, here's a question for you. If you weren't allowed to own a dental practice for the next 3 years, you had to be an associate for whatever reason, what would that associateship look like? What would you be looking for? Where would you be looking for it? And what would be like a red flag, not worth it, versus yes, let's do this?
That's a good question. Well, I think I would approach it similar to the way I approached the practice I was looking for, where I would kind of have a wish list.
Okay.
And before I even looked at any opportunities, I would make sure I had exactly what I was looking for. So to start, I would want to have an opportunity that was financially beneficial enough for me to be able to save up for practice ownership, or, pay down debt or whatever I was wanting to do with that money. I would also look for an opportunity where I'd be replacing another dentist.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I mean, financially, like, you need to be producing enough, which I think is not only important for financially for yourself, but also for proving to banks that you can produce and therefore buying a big enough practice. So, but why is it important that you'd be replacing another dentist?
I think that would be a surefire way to ensure that I have some niche or production to fall into in the practice.
Yeah.
As opposed to, some doc coming on is like, I need help, and you don't want to be the first person experimenting with that role. You want to go to an office that's used to having somebody, and you're taking over a predictable patient pool, and it's just very straightforward, and you have a lot of production.
Yeah, that's huge. The being the first associate at an office is a red flag. And unless you, and even if you know the person and know it's a great opportunity, still be very wary of that, because it's all projections. It's all in theory. They haven't actually done this yet, and they don't 100% know that they can support this, and the staff is probably still not going to trust you, versus if you're filling in another spot, they're like, oh, thank goodness, someone to like take all these patients, and we can schedule on your schedule too, because we've got plenty of work to be done. So I think that's a great point.
Absolutely. And I think on that same point of, you find somewhere where it meets your needs. Also, you have to make sure it's located in a position. They talk about this a lot in the episode, where it's not in a position where you want to practice in the future, or your non-compete doesn't prevent you from ownership opportunities moving forward.
Yeah. And the nightmare scenarios, and I don't know how common that is, but with the amount of corporate offices that people are working in these days, and they're out there and they're spread all over states, if your non-compete prevents you from working at multiple locations, that could be pretty bad. So definitely take a close look at that and do some planning. And I liked how they said that they admire the guys and girls who are looking for opportunities that are an hour away from where they eventually want to be, on purpose. And I think it takes a lot of foresight and maturity to do that. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Absolutely. And the last thing I would be looking for is somewhere where I'd be practicing the type of dentistry I want to do in the future.
Yeah.
And having maybe a clinical mentor. I'm not a big fan of the business mentor per se, where some people say like they want to go learn the business side from somebody and then open up their own practice.
Yeah.
I more prefer a clinical mentor. That's what I would be looking for.
Why is that? You say that. You can't just like not let me ask that question. Why would you not care as much about a business mentor?
Well, I guess it would depend on who it is. Are they, if you learn from somebody, then you're more likely to do what they do. And so is it somebody who I would like to replicate their success? Is there, whatever level they're at, is that where I want to be? And so for me to take somebody as a business mentor, it'd have to be somebody who's at a level that I want to be at one day. And I guess I can't say that about most dentists.
Well, and a lot of the systems and the way that things are done in a lot of dental practices is likely to be just an inherited, this is what we've always done, rather than an engineered, researched, proven, tested, this is what is ideal and best. And especially with the amount of information that we've been exposed to between people like Scott Luna and Breakaway and all these other, Hunter Smith, we've seen a lot of examples of how this can be done really well. And so the average pick a practice out of the hat might not be an ideal business mentorship opportunity. Is that kind of the point to summarize
exactly,
it?
If Graham Dursley, Justin Short, Scott Luna, any of those guys are hiring an associate to work side by side with them, that's a great opportunity. But, that's not who I'm thinking of when I think of some dentist hiring me as an associate.
Well, and the other thing I would say is to go back to a season 1 throwback, when Mark Costas talked about turning your associateship into a financial residency, he wasn't waiting for the owner doc to sit down and teach him. He was like rummaging through the front desk and saying, okay, so how do you file insurance, and how does accounts receivable work, and how does this work, and how does this work? He was learning like the tangible, how do you do all of this stuff, so that he understood it at a very tactical level, so then he could step back and engineer it better himself. So while you might not be taking a job because of mentorship within that realm, you can still get the most out of it by learning every time a patient cancels, or coming in a little early, or staying a little late, or maybe at lunch, or bothering the front desk with a bunch of questions. You're going to get way more out of it. And that space to learn and grow clinically, it would be hugely important to me. And that's kind of one of the reasons I did the Army, one of the reasons I did this residency. And so I think we're definitely on the same page there.
Absolutely. I think between, our little outro and our interview, our listeners have a really good idea of what to look for in associateship.
Cool. Awesome. Well, we will talk with you next time on the Shared Practices podcast. Take care.